You can guess. So it's clear the FAR is not controlling what matters, and we had to fight the code. And in addition to changing the FAR and the lot coverage and the extensions out over public space, we got covered by the AP because we had to fight to not have a garage in our house. And we don't own a car, and we're 2 blocks from Metro. But we had to fight and wait through a 9-month process to not have a garage. So the coding clearly has to change. But we live in this neighborhood. In this neighborhood, you don't need a garage, right? So that's the problem with zoning. And here's my... I spoke at the keynote of the Canadian Planners Session. This is the first time I tried this out, and I had to use O Canada, but this is the American example. So planning by zoning, it's a collection of slides I put together, and planning by coding equals planning to fail. And here we can do, okay. So the point is, thank you. The point is, this is how planning gets done in America. Smart people in their communities, working hard, donating their time, but because of the system that we have in place, we keep getting this outcome. So the message is the system needs to fail. But let's get a little bit more pessimistic before we see the brighter side. So what's happened is because we've separated everything from everything else, we need to reconnect it with these roadways. And so design in so many of our communities has become about what everyone complains about in our communities, which is traffic. So, we're designing our cities around the ever-increasing amounts of traffic, and goodness knows the traffic is a nightmare, so we do want our commute shortened. But the problem is, though, that there's a phenomenon that affects transportation behavior that's called induced demand. And induced demand, I'm about to show you something that tells me that it's well known, it's well understood, it's universally understood by engineers. But in my experience, induced demand does not affect how people behave in the traffic engineering profession. Induced demand says that this is what you think is going to happen. Your 20-year forecast says that traffic's going to increase, so you widen the road in order to be able to handle that increase. What happens, though, when you do that is that people change their behavior. The road is wider, so cars move more smoothly. People choose to buy a house an extra 10 miles out because the bathroom fixtures are better. They take trips certain hours they wouldn't normally take trips. They choose to live and work further apart. And so what happens is the actual demand increases beyond the widening. And of course, it's an ad infinitum experience. And the saying in the traffic profession among those who understand this is that adding lanes to reduce traffic is like loosening your belt to reduce obesity. And that's exactly how it functions. So here it is, Newsweek magazine. I was reading this article, and I cut it out so I could tell everyone. But that demand from drivers tends to quickly overwhelm the new supply. Today's engineers acknowledge that building new roads usually makes traffic worse. Well, those aren't the engineers I've met. These are the engineers I've met. They do it over and over again. They widen the road, the cars come, and then they're like, well, see, I told you the traffic was going to get worse. And in fact, this widening, this increasing of these facilities, is this like an engineer that understood induced demand? No, right? And the experience of being, stuck driving all day long, this is not a Photoshop. This isn't outside of Orlando. Walter Kulash took this picture. There's actually a reason for it. I won't get into the reason for it, but this is the experience we have, right, as drivers in this environment. But this constant widening is not just applied to our major arterials. These are the engineers now, the ones who do this Monday through Thursday. They're designing streets in your city on Friday. And forgive me, I must say that one engineering company that I know is participating here, Parsons Brinkerhoff, they get it. They have a placemaking division, and they're doing good work, and they understand this. But I don't deal with Parsons every day. I deal with, I won't tell you who, every day. But this is a typical now residential street. Notice someone was doing donuts on it, which you can do. Oops. Well, we've got a hyperkinetic. There's some donuts there in the street. You can't park on it. It's 40 feet wide. And this is an interesting comparison. This is a subdivision outside of D.C. from the 60s. Notice how wide the streets are compared to the houses, and then shot from the same height, here's a subdivision built in the 80s. The standards have just changed, this constant widening and widening, which is making our environment less comfortable. Even in Miami Beach, in a perfectly viable neighborhood where the streets were working very well, they had to redo the streets because they didn't drain properly, and they had to redo them to the new standard. So a 6-foot sidewalk becomes a 3-foot sidewalk, and cars are able to drive faster down the street. That's what happens. Communities are fighting back. Birmingham, Michigan, just one of many communities that are demanding that these standards go back to where they were. A Skinny Streets program in Portland, a city that's doing so much well, actually says what I need in my plans, which is for residential neighborhoods that aren't that heavily settled, single-family houses, you don't need 2 full lanes in each direction. Many of you, I know I did, grew up on a street where there was only about 12 feet of shared passageway that served trips in both directions. It's called a shared lane or a queuing lane. That's what makes a great residential neighborhood. It's illegal in most places, but we're working to change that. But this creation of an environment that's all about getting around means that people forgot that people should also be able to walk. And so here's a great collection of slides from Howie Frumpkin, who's an epidemiologist. He said, what if the U.S. government and all the state and local governments had a campaign to cause people not to walk? How would you accomplish that goal? So the first is to have streets that are just so noxious and wide and high speed that you wouldn't consider walking on them, and then, of course, have no sidewalks. Or create sidewalks up against high speed, multiple lanes of high speed, which no one would feel comfortable walking on. Or put the pole in the middle of the sidewalk. Or just stop the sidewalk and pick it up a bit later. Or the 2 ships that pass in the night sidewalk solution. And then, or just come out and say it, no pedestrians. Don't even try. And then so we've created this whole culture. We have the drive-in beverage liquor store. That always worries me. The drive-in bakery, drive-in flowers. We've got every aspect of life covered, from the wedding to, if it doesn't go so well, the child support, the pharmacy when you get older, and then finally your final resting place also in a drive-through, at least the wake. It's a window wake for the drive-through. And this one I've never really understood fully how it works. And then this idea that we drive to the gym to get on the treadmill to get our exercise, when we used to get our exercise by walking and biking around our communities. So I find it interesting, and I say this when I lecture to planners, it's interesting that the planners got their credibility and founded their profession based on the issue of health. And we now have a new health issue to deal with, which is all of the negative impacts that urban sprawl have had on the health of Americans. And this is a book that's by a number of authors, including gentleman Howard Frumpkin. It's 2 epidemiologists and a planner. And they've outlined all the ways, and they've documented and measured all the ways that if you live in urban sprawl, you're going to be less healthy than if you live in a traditional neighborhood or a inner city. So first of all, there's increased air pollution and asthma around the roads. Of course, increased traffic injuries. We have 40,000 a year in America, which is roughly the Vietnam War every year. Decreased physical activity, which leads, we'll get to that, increased heat island effects, increased income segregation, decreased social capital, and and negative mental health impacts. What you don't see here are the two biggest ones, which are the weight problem we have, obesity, and related to that, diabetes? Yes, early onset diabetes, which I just heard that 1/3 of the Americans born after 2000 are predicted to have diabetes, which is shocking.